Having a family member who finished only high school is a disgrace to the whole family. Engagement's off. Just as he said that, my father-in-law reached for a beer bottle nearby. And, unbelievably, he started pouring beer over my mother's head, who twisted her face in shame. I was lost for words at this shocking sight. But my mother-in-law, unconcerned, turned a mocking gaze towards me and said, "It's because there's something wrong with your mother, isn't it? Despite being a nurse, you couldn't find someone to marry you by the age of 40, right?" "Right, Rachel?" It wasn't me who snapped at that moment, it was my mother. "Then I'll cancel the $200 million account." Of course, my in-laws must have thought she was joking. After all, they had insulted us so much, there's no way we could have a $400 million fortune. That's what they had assumed. But the next moment, my father-in-law froze. "Rachel, can you call Tim?" He couldn't understand why Tim's name came up at that moment. My mother's words were not a bluff. It was the truth. When they realized that, my in-laws ended up begging for our forgiveness. "My name is Rachel. I'm currently 40 years old, single, and working at a hospital. I belong to a department dominated by women, where there's little chance for romance." However, concerned about this, a colleague from work introduced me to someone. That someone later became my husband, John Ortega. John works for a company that handles system-related work for our hospital. He's said to be 35 years old. I had heard rumors of him being a refreshing, handsome man. Such a person would normally be married or at least have a girlfriend. Yet, John had been single for several years. "My hobbies are touring on big bikes, fishing, and I also like camping. I often go alone." In other words, he was a prime catch not often found on the marriage market. But spending time with John revealed his playful side and his kindness in always putting others first, and before I knew it, I was drawn to him. When I proposed we start dating, he happily agreed, and after about 6 months, we were in a serious relationship with marriage in mind. Everything with John was going incredibly smoothly. We were both of a certain age and even talked about moving in together. "Rachel, what do you think?" "I'm okay with us moving in together." "I think so too. Plus, if we want kids, considering my age, it's better to decide sooner rather than later." Fortunately, our lifestyles and values aligned perfectly, so we quickly rented an apartment and started living together. A month after we began cohabitating, I was relaxing at home after a night shift. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting any deliveries today, and we hadn't told anyone about our new place. Who could it be? Wondering, I went to answer the door, and there stood a woman I didn't know. She covered her mouth with a fan and wore a hat and sunglasses, making it impossible to see her expression. Facing this suspicious person, I swallowed hard. "I'm Kelly, John's mother. I heard my son started living with someone, so I came by. It's awkward to talk here, may I come in?" Initially frozen with confusion, I eventually understood the situation. It seemed that John's mother had come to see if I was suitable for her son, now that he had finally started a serious relationship and moved in with someone. "My son has always been poor at judging character. If you're going to be my daughter-in-law, you need to be perfect," she said. "Okay." Although her directness made me uncomfortable, I let her into the room. The last thing I wanted was to cause any issues that could strain my relationship with John. So, I just smiled and made sure not to argue with my mother-in-law. Without even a "may I come in," she barged into the room, ran her index finger across the top of the cabinet by the entrance, and, frowning, said, "Oh, there's dust here. If you don't clean every day, the whole house will end up a dusty mess, you know?" The dust wasn't as bad as my mother-in-law made it out to be. It was just the normal amount that accumulates from living. So, I was about to make an excuse on the spot, but she didn't even let me get that far and started saying, "Clean up now, and then serve some tea immediately." Normally, you'd offer it without being asked, right? Troubled as I was, I vacuumed and ventilated the room, then tidied up and called out to my mother-in-law. Then, with a huff, she said, "This is less than 30 points. As a wife, that's a failing grade," and blandly reported her grading. Reluctantly, I apologized and served her the tea as she demanded, only to be told, "This cheap stuff tastes awful, and when I served some snacks, these are the worst knockoffs of luxury goods." Fuming with anger at my mother-in-law, who came unannounced only to say dreadful things, I told myself to endure it and kept quiet. After staying for about an hour and a half, it was unclear if she was satisfied, but she said, "Well, I'll let it go at this for now. But if you're serious about marrying my son, you better work harder. Frankly, you look quite old, and I was against it. But for now, just make sure not to act above your station," and left with that snide remark. Exhausted from my mother-in-law's surprise visit, I ended up falling asleep on the sofa without doing any housework or preparing dinner. Then, I was awakened by John returning from work. "Oh, sorry. I didn't manage to do anything around the house." As I hurriedly tried to get up and start on the chores, John gently spoke to me. "Don't be mad, just calm down." "What happened?" It's rare for Rachel to be sleeping like a log on the sofa. Though he asked as if he didn't know, I couldn't bring myself to say that his mother had come today, giving me looks as if she was assessing me. For the moment, I just told him about his mother's visit. His face immediately tensed up. And after a heavy sigh, he apologized. "Sorry, my mom must have said something rude, right? I'm really sorry." I hadn't even told him what happened today. Yet, he apologized as if he knew something. "Has something like this happened before?" Looking guiltily down, John shared. "My mom's a bit eccentric. She cares a lot about status." It seems my mother-in-law has a history of being harsh to John's previous girlfriends, ultimately causing them to break up. Maybe her sudden visit was an attempt to break us up as well. I had thought John was just not on the marriage market due to his unique hobbies, but it seems there was more to it. "I knew I had to tell you someday. I just didn't want to be disliked by you, Rachel. I'm sorry." John apologized again. It appears that his mother had interfered in the same way with his past girlfriends, ultimately leading to breakups. He had kept our relationship a secret for that reason. But his mother was relentless. So, she found out. We concluded she must have followed us after seeing us together somewhere. I was taken aback when I heard it, but given what I witnessed from his mother today, it wasn't out of the question. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't anxious. But I love John. When I told him so, John smiled, relieved. However, that relief was short-lived. Soon after, his mother targeted me again, choosing a day right after my night shift. "Well, look at this mess. If you're going to work irregular hours as a nurse, why not hire a helper?" "Oh, but I guess nurses don't have the money for that." My apologies. This is exactly the problem. "Don't rely on John's earnings, learn to earn your own way," she scoffed. Apparently, she had seen me leaving the hospital and assumed I was a nurse due to my hours. Knowing arguing with her was futile, I kept silent. My mother-in-law, mistaking my silence for admission, ramped up the harassment. "As a nurse, well, I might begrudgingly accept the marriage, but in return, you'll have to fulfill your duties as a wife properly. Understand? Marrying into the firstborn's family isn't something to be taken lightly. If there's anything amiss, I'll be sure to give you a strict lesson," she said. It was probably all about producing an heir or doing all the housework as expected of a wife. Though not said directly, I was sure that was what she meant. So, I posed a question. "By the way, how did you know which days I work nights?" With a smug look, she snorted and answered. "Our daughter-in-law from your hospital is a nurse. I had her check your schedule by dropping your name, blatantly overstepping boundaries." While wondering why she would go to such lengths to monitor me yet miss the essential parts, I ended the conversation with, "All right." And then, after a year and a half of dating and overcoming various challenges, as our jobs started to stabilize, we finally decided to get married. Despite everything my mother did, you're the first person who's stayed by my side. I've made up my mind. "I will make you happy, so please marry me," John said, and we got engaged. Since I come from a single-parent family, we planned to quickly greet my mother before heading to John's parents. However, just before, his mother suggested, "Why don't we all go out for a meal at a fancy restaurant, and bring your parents along too?" I sensed there was a catch. Despite my suspicions, I reminded myself this would be the last ordeal and arranged a meeting for the marriage introduction. On the day, we were led to a private room in a fancy restaurant I'd never entered before, where both families met for the first time. My mother-in-law was dressed in an expensive-looking dress, and my father-in-law was sharply dressed in an expensive suit. As soon as we sat down, he introduced himself with a self-satisfied look, handing out his business card as if it was something to brag about. Apparently, he was a big-shot bank president, and my mother, wide-eyed, murmured in awe, "That's impressive." Then, without anyone asking, my mother-in-law started boasting. I graduated top of my class from a prestigious university and have been supporting the household since marrying my husband. I've raised our sons to be fine men, and I consider myself the epitome of a wife. She then implied that my mother should state her educational background, but John tried to change the subject too late. And why do we not see Rachel's father here? I'm a single mother who raised her daughter alone. So, there's no father present. My mother answered with a slightly troubled look. Immediately, my in-laws began to smirk condescendingly. My mother-in-law mockingly laughed. Then, you must have a low education level, right? A woman abandoned by her partner is less likely than a high school graduate. And what about your education? My father-in-law added insult to injury, trying to embarrass my mother further. Despite John and my attempts to intervene, they were relentless. Finally, my mother, her face twisted in shame, honestly answered. I'm embarrassed to say, but I dropped out of college. My mother-in-law, like at our first meeting, snapped her fan closed and snorted, "Oh my, a college dropout." A family with a college dropout is a disgrace to the entire clan. The engagement is off. My father-in-law went as far as to say, causing me to tremble with anger. Then, my mother suddenly raised her head and protested to my in-laws. My educational background has nothing to do with my daughter's marriage. But my mother-in-law turned to me, blatantly disparaging me. It's because there's something wrong with your mother, isn't it? Despite being a nurse, you couldn't find someone to marry you by the age of 40, right? Right, Rachel? The next moment, unbelievably, my father-in-law poured beer over my mother's head. We are talking right now. You haven't been given permission to speak, have you? My mother was left speechless in shock. Seeing this, John stood up, unable to bear it any longer, but it was not him but my mother who stopped him with a hand gesture. Then I'll be canceling the $400 million account. My usually calm and never yelling mother said, her voice shaking with anger. Seeing their reaction, my in-laws chuckled, what a joke. And what a ridiculous way to argue, but they were about to be shocked by a startling truth. A passing employee hurriedly brought something to clean up, and after my mother briefly left the table, she returned with a smile and said to me, "Rachel, could you call Tim, please?" At that moment, the smile vanished from my father-in-law's face who had been mocking us earlier. Trembling, he barely managed to say, "Tim. Why bring up Tim's name?" Neither my mother nor I answered him. Following my mother's request, I was about to stand up and call Tim when my mother-in-law, sensing something, tried to stop me. Wait, just a minute. We're still talking here. But for me, enough was enough. My mother had given up her dreams to have me at a young age and raised me all by herself, enduring disparagement. I could tolerate a lot when it came to myself, but not when it came to my mother. Who is Tim? John looked puzzled, not keeping up with the conversation. So, I explained that Tim was the branch manager of the bank where my mother had an account. My mother has an account worth $400 million, including cash deposits and various financial instruments like stocks. Given the amount, Tim, the branch manager, naturally handles her account. I said. This news caused even more disturbance among my in-laws, particularly my father-in-law, who was stunned to learn that my mother had such a significant sum in a branch of the bank he presided over. He had thought it was all a bluff, but the mention of the branch manager's name and my move to actually call him made it seem all too real. Trying to salvage the situation, my father-in-law, maintaining a facade of composure, made a ridiculous suggestion. Well, let's hear you out. And pouring beer over your head was just a way to let commoners enjoy a good beer with all their senses. So, it was not meant as an insult. Don't get it wrong, okay? His condescending tone only reignited my anger. It was clear his pride was still in the way. Thinking that these people wouldn't understand unless I spoke up firmly, I directed a cold gaze at them and bluntly said, "There's no reason for us to listen to someone who behaves like that. Pouring beer over someone's head is not something a decent person does. We'll be speaking to the branch manager about the insult and the cleaning bill for my mother's clothes, and we'll proceed with closing the account," I retorted, colder than ever. My father-in-law, taken aback by my boldness, blustered. "If this turns out to be a joke, I'll sue all of you." Then, my mother sighed softly and placed a business card in front of my father-in-law, who went from red-faced anger to ashen in an instant. When my mother-in-law nervously asked what company it was, my father-in-law whispered, It's one of our biggest corporate clients. No way. Why is the CEO of that company you? My mother-in-law's face turned pale as she turned back to us. My mother, who had been grimacing in humiliation just moments before, now introduced herself with a resolved expression. Let me reintroduce myself. I'm Nora, Rachel's mother and the president and CEO of this company. I usually send my vice president or other employees for regular transactions, so it's fine if you don't remember me. Actually, the initial greetings to your company were made by the previous president. The transition to me happened afterward. Well, now I see how insignificant my position as president is to you. Suddenly, my father-in-law began to prostrate himself on the floor. Despite being a bank president himself, not recognizing the president of a major client company in front of him was more than just an embarrassing mistake. This incident slowly began to reveal that my father-in-law was nothing more than a figurehead. The story goes back to when my mother was pregnant with me in her sophomore year of college. Known for her intelligence and popularity, she attended one of the top schools, dreaming of becoming a designer. Normally, students from her school would secure bright futures. But my mother couldn't give up her dream and even confronted her parents, my grandparents, wanting to attend a design school instead. I want to go to a design school for further studies. I've decided I want to pursue a career in design. Of course, my grandparents were opposed. They refused to support her financially if she chose a design school over the college, leading to a lot of frustration for my mother. That's when she reconnected with my father, her middle school classmate. My father, a college dropout working on construction sites. And my mother hit it off, leading to my mother getting pregnant at 17. I was scolded severely, not just by my teachers and friends, but my parents were furious. They refused to pay the rest of my school fees, so I couldn't take a leave of absence and had to drop out. I had to give up my dream of becoming a designer. But I'm glad I got pregnant with Rachel. That's something I'm sure of. My mother recounted with sincerity in her eyes. However, my mother-in-law sneered and countered. Of course, getting pregnant as a student and then being forced to drop out is expected, isn't it? Why state the obvious as if it's something noble? It's nothing but a result of your own actions, and not a story worth praising. Plus, being abandoned by the very person who got you pregnant, how pathetic. And what does this have to do with the current situation? Are you trying to garner sympathy? Ha, don't make me laugh. Then my mother, narrowing her eyes, continued her story calmly. After being forced to drop out of school and disowned by her family, she lived with my father, the child's father. They were indeed married. My father had promised to take responsibility and married my mother, but he collapsed suddenly at work one day and never came home. My mother heard from the company presidents at the time how it was a great loss because my father was a very hard worker and sincere. With no diploma and no chance of pursuing her dream as a designer anymore. My mother had a duty to raise me properly. That required money, so she resolved to speak to the president at the time. Please let me work here. I'll carry heavy things, I'll get any qualifications needed. I don't need any special allowances or treatment, just please let me work here. And so, my mother became a rare female construction worker at the time. To my father-in-law, who looked puzzled, my mother said with a calm face. A small company that only had 10 employees at the time has grown this big. I still believe that's something to be proud of. My father-in-law, who hadn't caught on yet, finally seemed to realize what she meant. You can't mean you're the successor of that company, and after taking over as president, you've grown it to this size. My mother just smiled, which only made my father-in-law more anxious. He started fidgeting, clearly unsettled. It seemed my mother-in-law realized as well, and despite having demeaned my mother earlier, she now looked visibly shaken, her eyes darting around. Wait, if you put it that way, it sounds like that small company is now this big company we have a major contract with. Surely, a dropout couldn't possibly. But then, both of them looked back at my mother's business card again. My mother nodded smugly. My in-laws trembled, realizing the person they had looked down upon had climbed from the depths to become a true success story. You judged my mother based on her being a dropout or leaving college, right? But to her now, being a dropout or anything like that doesn't matter. She's achieved success on her own and raised me well. That's the reality. I said. My father-in-law, being a big bank president, must have understood the magnitude of my mother's achievements. It was time to press the point. Sure, getting pregnant and giving birth have many risks. But because of my mother's decision, I am here today, and she raised me to be the person I am. You can't twist this fact. With the results to show for it, why do you find joy in nitpicking the process? Is that the right thing to do? Unable to bear my cold gaze, my father-in-law averted his eyes, looking frustrated. My mother-in-law, still trying to find some way to retort, muttered, "Okay, so your mother is amazing. But you're just a nurse. Planning to live off your mother and husband's money, huh? How disappointing. You're just riding on your mother's coattails, how pathetic. Just because your mother is incredible doesn't make you special, you know?" It seems that's just her nature. Shifting the target to me since she couldn't find fault with my mother anymore. Then John, finding it easier to speak up, finally said, "Mom, you've been mistaken all along. Rachel isn't a nurse. She's a doctor." This revelation stunned my in-laws. Especially my mother-in-law, who had been concocting her own narratives, now reduced to silently mouthing words in shock. After a moment of silence, my father-in-law, with a strained voice, began to blame my mother-in-law. "You said Rachel was just a nurse, an insignificant person. But what now? She turns out to be a doctor. Did you deceive me? What's with that tone? All this time, I've been keeping unwanted bugs away from John, haven't I? And now, a small mistake and it's all my fault. You're the one always blaming others without doing anything yourself." They began to argue among themselves, a clear sign of discord. Witnessing this unbearable scene, I let out a sigh and revealed the truth. I've always wondered. If the second son's wife was a nurse at the same hospital as me, knowing my shift schedule, she couldn't have been a stranger. My mother, sensing what this meant, smiled. John, knowing everything, stayed silent, waiting for me to continue. My in-laws swallowed hard, watching us intently. In the midst of this, the truth that shocked them was revealed. The second son's wife, who had been leaking my shifts to my mother-in-law, was a nurse from the same clinic. Feeling guilty, she apologized to me. My mother-in-law had mistaken me for a nurse, so she deliberately hid the fact that I was a doctor. Her name was Michelle Smith. You understand now, don't you? At those words, my father-in-law stood up abruptly. "Smith. Wait, that's my wife's maiden name." He began to panic. "What? Divorced? When did this happen? I had no idea." My mother-in-law exclaimed, clearly disturbed. But John, with a snort, revealed the truth. They're not divorced, nor is it the maiden name. You know why? Because he changed her family name. Unable to bear the fact, my in-laws' complexions worsened. I've never heard of such a thing. What's going on? My mother-in-law collapsed to her knees. My father-in-law, who had assumed his second son had brought a wife home, murmured to himself in shock, sinking down like my mother-in-law. As they struggled with the revelations, I decided it was time to deliver the final blow. John has something to say about our marriage as well. I hinted, causing my mother-in-law to cover her ears and shake her head in denial. My father-in-law, in a daze, turned to John, who placed a marriage certificate on the table and declared, "I can't deal with any more of your farces. Depending on how you acted, I thought I could endure it, but pouring beer on someone, berating them, and taking pleasure in their misfortune is just shameful behavior for parents." Stung by their beloved son's harsh words, my in-laws looked on the verge of tears. My mother-in-law, finally grasping the situation, begged us to wait. "Please reconsider. Please, stop making things difficult for us." My mother-in-law pleaded, her voice quivering. My father-in-law, desperate to appease us, added, "If only you had told us you were the president from the start, none of this nonsense would have happened. And to think, canceling a $400 million account over this, impossible, right? John, calm down. Don't do something unnecessary." Their pleas felt like a last-ditch effort, leaving me speechless with disbelief. What are you even saying now? It's you two who orchestrated this situation. You've brought this upon yourselves. Such a thing, John. They protested, but my mother, having had enough, began calling her phone. "Tim? It's been a while." "Yes, I wanted to talk about the account." As my mother spoke, my father-in-law seemed to realize the gravity of the situation. "I'm so sorry. Please, not the cancellation." However, my mother, looking on with a cold gaze, sharply retorted, "If I weren't the president of one of your bank's major clients, but instead a single mother working night shifts or juggling part-time jobs, would you have apologized to us face to face? Unable to respond immediately, John quickly backed up my mother. Dealing with people who judge others solely based on appearances or titles is not something we're willing to tolerate. We're done with your family for good. So, please, don't bother me, Rachel, or my mother-in-law anymore. I decide my own life. Realizing they were losing their precious son and facing damage to the bank, my in-laws broke down in tears. You've lived looking down on others, and now it's come back to haunt you. Learn from this and become someone who can treat people with kindness. Though, it might be too late for that. The reason both your sons chose to leave the house is undoubtedly because of you. By the way, mother-in-law, who really is the fox borrowing the tiger's fierceness between you and me? Wink. This sarcasm hit my mother-in-law hard, causing her to shed tears of frustration. In the end, both could only offer shallow apologies. Despite everything, my mother isn't someone who acts out of spite. But questioning whether having him as the bank president was the right choice, she discussed the incident in front of the board members, prompting the dignitaries to call an emergency meeting. It turns out my father-in-law was just a placeholder until the next president was decided. He must have known this more than anyone. Eventually, he apologized for the beer incident, paid for the cleaning, and then resigned from his position as president. The underlying dissatisfaction with his leadership within the bank, coupled with the warning from a major client, my mother, forced him to step down. Unable to find re-employment at 58 and unwilling to accept ordinary work due to his previous elite status. He's been stuck in a negative loop. My mother-in-law, boasting about her university degree but without a career, is just another 58-year-old housewife. Starting part-time jobs only to quit days later saying, "How can I be expected to sort someone else's packages?" She's been blacklisted as a cautionary figure in the region. Having money but lacking trust and credibility, and then losing their sons to marriage. They've faced a lonely old age due to their selfish and disdainful behavior. Learning about my in-laws' fate, my mother chuckled, having money doesn't guarantee happiness. Rachel, from now on, live supporting each other with John. After getting married, I took a break from work to focus on raising our child. Now that our child is older and in daycare, I've happily returned to work, feeling fulfilled every day. The nurse who apologized to me has been forgiven, and we now share a good relationship of mutual trust between doctor and nurse in obstetrics and gynecology. Soon, I plan to return to my hometown to open my own gynecology clinic. Naturally, John's company will handle all the systems, and everything related to the clinic's design and construction will be entrusted to my mother's company. After giving up her dream once, my mother, through immense effort, expanded the company my father was part of and now runs a construction company capable of handling design work. "I'm designing my daughter's clinic," she boasts to the neighbors, her face shining brighter than ever before.